Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of EUnity Lewes. In a moment, I'll hand over to Norman Baker, who will formally introduce our speaker for the evening, Tom Brake MP, who is the Lib Dem spokesman on Brexit. But first, I just want to very briefly explain how we're going to work this evening. Tom, when it's his turn, will speak for 15-20 minutes or so, fairly briefly. We will then have a break, and during the break, we would like you to think up some questions to ask Tom. And you will all find, you should all have found a piece of paper on your seats. And about 45% of you should have found a pen or a pencil. A few meetings ago, that would have been 100%, but there's been some attrition on the rest of the and we would really rather like to have them back at the end of the night. Anyway, during the break, we would like you to write any questions you may have. Write them twice, give one copy to me or to us, a member of the committee, and we'll sort them into the emerging themes, which will form the basis for discussion. And that first piece of paper should have your name clearly written on it. Secondly, if your name is called, we will then ask you to stand up and put your question and take part in the discussion that ensues. The break should be long enough for anyone who wants to go down and get a drink or refill to do just that. We aim to finish between 9:15 to allow Tom to catch his train back to his constituency. So, no more ado, I'll pass the baton on to Norman.
Thanks very much. And I was reflecting earlier on today that when I lost my seat in 2015, I was actually quite relaxed about it, perhaps even relieved. And I can tell Tom I discovered that it's a miracle of medicine because it makes you younger when you actually lose your seat. But when we lost the referendum, I felt I'd lost my country, which is a much more serious feeling. I wondered who these people were who voted to leave. And I was not encouraged by the fact that the top Google search next day is, what is the EU? I remember some comedian suggesting that those in Sunderland, that was the first town or city to declare, when they voted to leave, had actually thought they were voting to leave Sunderland. It may not be true. There's been so many, sorry, anyone from Sunderland, I apologise for that joke. There's been so many bad stories in the papers, it's almost incredible that anyone still wants to leave, and I'm not going to go through them all, just pick out one at random. This is the Financial Times, which I assume we can rely on. Medicines and food stockpile in case of no deal. Is this what we've come to as a country, for when they're stockpiling medicines and food, and people are apparently quite satisfied that that's going on? I actually think we should put that inside of a bus, actually, so people can see it and make their own judgments on it when they do that. Anyway, you're not here to hear from me, I'm happy to say. You're here to hear from Tom. And Tom and I arrived together in the House of Commons in 1997. We've both been through the campaigning mill beforehand. We both lost in 92, and we both came in on that wave, which was so helpful to us in 97 when the Tories fell apart at the end of John Major's time. And Tom, I think, is now, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, the longest serving Lib Dem MP in the House of Commons. He's still only 37, so he's doing quite well for himself. He's the MP for Carshalton and Wallington, as you've heard. Looking at his website today to remind me of his activities and achievements, he seems to have shadowed every department going in the House of Commons, or indeed being in government, deputy leader of the House of Commons, and served in the Whip's office as well. So he's been around the houses and knows, I think, every department inside out, which just as well, because he's now shadowing the Brexit department. Of course, that has an impact on all departments in government and all life outside as well. It's always good to hear from Tom. I've always admired Tom for his courage and his capability, and I've always thought he was a rather nice guy as well. which isn't anything you can say about people in politics, but it's true, for Tom. So I wish there were more of you in Parliament, Tom, than we have at the moment. If we had more of you, we perhaps wouldn't be in the mess we're in at the present time. But anyway, Tom Bray.
Thank you very much, Norman and Richard. And Norman is also greatly missed in Parliament, where he made a fantastic contribution for the Lib Dems. And also when he was a minister, I was just talking to someone a few days ago about the impact that he made in his role as a transport minister on the issue of cycling, for instance, something that is of interest to me as well. But if we can't get Norman back, there are other Liberal Democrats waiting in the wings like Kelly Marie who can play that role for us locally at some point in the future. So, as Norman said, I've been a Member of Parliament for 21 years now, and I suppose every now and again in a political career there are things that happen that make you really, really angry. And I got involved in politics in the early 1980s because I was angry with our then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and what she was doing. Some of you will recall that that was a rather strange period of our political history where there were people, miners or people supporting the miners, standing on street corners collecting money for the miners' strike, including in London. So it was quite an unusual, sort of disturbing period of our political history. So that is what got me involved in politics. We then had another significant event, which Norman will remember and was actively sort of involved in and has pursued since, and that was the issue of the Iraq War, which really got me angry as well. And I and others, and I'm sure Norman and Charles Kennedy were very prominent in the Iraq War march. And then we had Brexit. And I cannot think of anything that has, in terms of a decision that a country could take, that is as pointless and damaging as that decision that was taken on the 23rd of June 2016. And that's why I want to try and ensure that in a democratic way that we go about overturning or changing the direction the country is going in. Now I have a sort of a European sort of history of sorts, in that when I was 8 years old, my father decided that he was going to go and get a job in Paris. So we were living in Derby at the time, we moved to Paris, to the outskirts of Paris. Now, when we moved, actually the UK was not in the EU at that point. But he then moved on to, in 1980, the family moved. I came back to go to university, but he moved off to Portugal and got a job in Portugal, and at that point, therefore, was using the full rights that he had as a member of the European Union to go and live and work in another country. And he was able to compete on an equal basis with anyone else who was applying for that position in Portugal, and knew that if he was the best person for the job, then he was going to get it. There was nothing that was going to get in the way of him taking up that job. And my younger sister lives in Portugal with her family, and so I understand what they're going through in terms of how they feel about the impact, because it's not just about the impact that this decision has had on the 3 million plus EU citizens who live here, but also the impact that it's had on 1.5 to 2 million people, depending on who you believe, who live, UK citizens who live in the EU. So it was, in my view, an appalling decision, and I suppose politicians like me, in fact, I didn't think we were going to win the election. I didn't think we were going to win the referendum, because I have represented, as I said, at that point I would have represented Carshot and Wallington as a Member of Parliament for 18 years. And I'm a Liberal Democrat. We are pro-European. During successive European election campaign, we would have talked positively about the benefits of the European Union, yet I could sense from the canvassing that I was doing in the run-up to the referendum that we weren't even going to win my particular seat, and we didn't do that. The result was something like 53% voting to leave, 47% voting to remain. And it was very geographic. So if anyone knows Carshot and Wallington, there's a large estate called the St Helier Estate. It was the largest social housing project ever built in Europe at the time it was built, 1930s. And there was a band in the north of my constituency that voted to leave, which is where the St Helier estate is, Wandle Valley, the poorer parts of the constituency, and then a band in the south, Coshall Beaches, Woodcott, parts of Purley that are in my constituency that voted to remain. In other words, the poorer section voted to leave, the wealthier section voted to remain. So I think we, perhaps as politicians, should have spotted that the things that I think are, that I've experienced, so living in another country, going to an international school, having friends who live in different parts of the world, is, yes, that's my experience, but it's not the experience of many people who live on the St Helier estate, and they don't necessarily, some of them see the value of having the sort of society that we had, and I hope we will continue to have after the EU referendum vote. So, I mean, where are we now in terms of what is happening in Parliament? We are in a position where we're in a very, very uncertain time, and I don't think there's anyone at the moment who can predict where we're going to end up. What we know, I mean, there are certain fixed points. So Mr. Barnier has said that the beginning of November is a fixed point. He has said that he will allow the negotiations, the discussions to continue until that point. Now, he's already shown a bit of flexibility because he was originally saying that the EU needed 6 months in which to consider the deal, because they have processes that they need to go through to ratify whatever deal has been struck with the UK government. So he's allowed a bit of flexibility. Then we have the other milestone, which is March, 29th of March. So there are certain fixed points, but what's going to happen between now and then is completely uncertain. So potentially, by the beginning of November, we could have a scenario where the government have finished negotiating with the EU, they have come up with a deal. Might be Chequers, might be something like Chequers, and in which case, if they do, then Parliament has to have what the Prime Minister is calling a meaningful vote. So the one vote, the significant vote that the government lost, was on the issue, the Dominic Grieve Amendment, which was about forcing the government to accept that there should be a meaningful vote. But what the Prime Minister believes is a meaningful vote is one which offers to members of Parliament the choice between the Chequers deal, if that is what has been agreed with the European Union, or no deal. In other words, the things that Norman has just referred to in terms of that headline. No deal as an option is a 15-mile tailback on the approach to Dover. It's stockpiling medicines, which the Secretary of State for Health has already instructed pharmaceutical companies to do, and has said, we're going to cover, or we are willing to talk to you about the extra costs that you're going to incur for that, because we will talk to you about covering those extra costs. It is a huge amount of additional work, administrative work for every single company that exports and imports from the European Union. So that is what no deal means. And so the Prime Minister has offered us what I think is not a meaningful vote or a meaningful choice between something like Chequers, which it's hard to know whether in fact the EU are willing to entertain that or not, or no deal, which is disastrous for the United Kingdom. That, for me, is not meaningful, and we will try and force the government's hand on this and make sure that Parliament has a choice which also includes voting to stay in the European Union. So then it becomes meaningful. So if the Prime Minister comes forward with that, and we then have this meaningful vote, Parliament would then have, if we're successful in amending it, Parliament would have the option of voting to stay in the European Union. And this meaningful vote, we will also try to amend the motion the government has to bring forward so that this meaningful vote can take place in Parliament, to amend that motion so that it not only says members of Parliament will have a choice about voting to stay in the EU, but it will also be amended to say whatever Parliament agrees can only be ratified on the back of a people's vote, or a final say on the deal. Now, this process is so confused that there are many, many different opinions about whether it is possible to do what I have just said in terms of amending that motion. If you believe the Constitution Unit, I think they say yes, it is possible to amend the motion. If you believe the Institute of Government, then they think it isn't. If you talk to the clerks, and the most senior clerk who's dealing with this bill, he wasn't certain and was asking me what I thought about it, which I mean, yes, I am the party spokesman, but he's the person who's got sort of 25 years of procedural knowledge of how Parliament works. So, but it gives you a picture of a degree of confusion even about how this process is actually going to work. Now, it is possible also that by the beginning of November, that the government won't have secured a deal, and that they will come to Parliament and say, well, actually, sorry, we haven't secured a deal, or the one that was on offer was so bad, we'd prefer to crash out of the European Union. That is a possibility, albeit quite a strange option, because if I was a Member of Parliament, I would not want to go to my constituents and say, don't worry, I have just voted for something which the government have told me is going to lead to a 15-mile tailback at Dover, food shortages, the army deployed to address those issues. So that would not be a good position to go and try to sell to my constituents. But it's possible, I suppose, that the Prime Minister may come forward with no deal. At that point, there are enough, I believe, I hope, enough sensible members of Parliament who will say, well, the government, you have spelt out to us the consequences of no deal, and it is so horrendous that we are not going to accept it. And then what happens, again, is not clear, because there isn't a particularly straightforward process that sort of enables members of Parliament who just objected to the government to then bring forward something, in effect, of our own, to just undo or challenge what the government are saying that this is the route we now have to go down in terms of no deal. But I'm reasonably confident that Parliament is flexible enough, if a majority of MPs think no deal is a disaster, to find a way of forcing the government's hand and, for instance, saying, well, we don't accept no deal, you, the government, have got to go back to Mr. Barnier and try and negotiate some more, or we don't accept this. We now want to force your hand and require you to hold a vote on the deal, or a people's vote. So we've got any number of different permutations. Unfortunately, there's a very useful flowchart both on the Constitution Unit and the Institute for Government website, which I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at. But most of those flowcharts arrive at no deal as the outcome of the different routes you can take. So if we get to, if we arrive at no deal, or it looks as though there's going to be no deal, we then have the option of extending Article 50. Now, so far, the different European countries have said, and I was talking to the Irish ambassador earlier today, that if the UK decides we need more time to negotiate, either because we are very close to reaching a deal, or alternatively, we want to have time to enable a people's vote to take place, that those governments around the EU will agree to Article 50 being extended. It does require each and every single one of those 27 countries to agree to it, mind you, which is why I have asked the government to confirm, which they won't do, if they have already entered into discussions with all of the 27 EU countries, just to make sure that if we reach that pass, that they will actually say, yes, you can extend, we're happy for you to extend Article 50. And certainly we are already at the stage where, if at some point the UK government and Parliament, more likely Parliament, decides that there should be a people's vote, we are already at the stage where we have to seek an extension of Article 50. We do not have time by March the 29th to have a referendum. Now you say, well, why not? Well, the answer is because, first of all, we need legislation. We can't just have a referendum. We have to have a bill, we have to debate it in Commons, we have to debate it in the Lords. Now, whilst legislation can be pushed through in 3 days, so for instance, legislation where we're trying to prescribe a terrorist organisation, so an organisation here that's a membership organisation where people are paying money to be a member or raising funds for money that perhaps ends up in the hands of terrorists somewhere else, we can do that in 3 days. But I think from a democratic point of view, the government bringing forward legislation about a referendum and forcing it through the emergency procedure would probably not be the right approach. So it should follow the normal procedures, the normal timescale. So we would need legislation. And then the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission has 10 weeks in which to consider the question. The Electoral Commission has to look at the question for 10 weeks and satisfy themselves that it is a fair question. In other words, so if we said, well, obviously the question is, do you want to crash out of the European Union and cause a 15-mile tailback approaches to Dover, or would you prefer to stay in the European Union with all the benefits we derive from that? The Electoral Commission would say, no, that is not a fair question, go back to the drawing board and come forward with something else. So they have a 10-week period in which to consider the question, and then after that, we then have a referendum campaign. Now, the referendum campaign in June 2 years ago lasted for 10 weeks. I think it would be hard for us to argue that it should be anything shorter than 10 weeks. So you've already got a period of legislation, the length of which is a little bit uncertain, followed by a definite 10 weeks for the Electoral Commission to consider the question, followed by a definite, probably 10 weeks or thereabouts, for the referendum campaign itself. In other words, if we want to have a people's vote, we need to extend Article 50. So far, the Prime Minister has said, over my dead body, will I extend Article 50? Well, I have views about that, but that is the position that she has adopted so far, and you know, it's going to be, well, I think she's going to have to do a U-turn. I think she's going to have to do an embarrassing U-turn, because even if she doesn't want to extend Article 50 for the purposes of allowing a people's vote, we are very close to the point where she's going to have to extend it, because the negotiations are not going to conclude within the time frame. So what we might see is the UK government saying to Mr Barnier, look, we really need some more time to do this, and him saying, well, okay, well, I'll give you another sort of 3 months, and then you know, we will then be able to have our sort of 4 or 5 months that the EU requires to deliberate on this. But there is another milestone which I hadn't mentioned, which is there are European elections, and obviously for the Brexiters, the idea that we would be putting up candidates for a European election taking place, you know, spring, summer next year would be problematic, because many of them thought we were going to be leaving the European Union the day after we voted on the 24th of June 2016, and would be a bit surprised if we're putting up candidates for a European Parliament election. But in fact, we as a party, the Lib Dems, we are already looking at our own internal party procedures about what we will do if there is, in fact, well, first of all, if there's a people's vote where we vote to stay in the European Union, then we've got to have candidates in an election. A bit difficult, because what's happened with the seats in the European Parliament is that they have already been reallocated. They're sort of notionally being reallocated, half of them to existing EU countries, the existing 27, and half of them held back to be given to countries that join the European Union at some point in the future. So it's a bit difficult if we go back and say, look, sorry, can we have our seats back? We want to be, you know, we want to have members of the European Parliament elected, but it's not impossible. The great thing, according to Catherine Bearder, a member of the European Parliament, is that the European Union, when it wants to be, can be very flexible. Although it's an organisation that is a body that is driven very much by the rule of law, sometimes when it needs to, it can find a very quick way of resolving matters of that nature. So I think they would, if we said, right, well, we've got to extend Article 50, we've got to have a people's vote, we're going to have it, it'll be in May, can we have our seats back? They would find a way of enabling that to happen and allowing the UK to be represented in the European Parliament. So just to perhaps to finish on where are we in terms of the numbers of MPs on the different sides. The government, as you'll know, is only there because they've got the support of the DUP. Now, the DUP have some very strong views about any solution to the Northern Ireland border problem that involves there being probably only a very, very, very discreet border in the Irish Sea. But that, realistically, is probably the only way the government can resolve the Northern Ireland border problem. There are already controls between UK mainland and Northern Ireland around things like food. So you could argue, well, they're already happening, so just a little bit more of what's already happening. So you've got, obviously, the DUP, depending on what the government do, if they start talking about anything that smells to them of being a border in the Irish Sea, then they may walk at that point. I don't think they will. I think they'll try to extract the maximum, and I think if push comes to shove, they'll probably stay on board. You have clearly got, we know there are at least 4 Labour MPs who are quite happy to vote with the government on Brexit. So the reason that a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago now, that the vote in Parliament on the trade bill and the customs bill, where there was a reference to staying in a customs union, both those bills, the reason that was lost is because 4 Labour MPs voted with the government. They either abstained or voted with the Labour on the official Labour Party line. The government would have lost those votes. And I think we then might have had a crisis in government happening earlier than potentially we're going to have now. So we've got those 4 Labour MPs, and if, for instance, we get into a vote about Chequers, where the Labour Party position is they have set their 6 red lines, and frankly, there is absolutely no way the government can meet those 6 red lines. It's impossible. So if they set those lines intending observing them, they're not going to support anything the government comes forward with. But we might lose, I suspect, perhaps a few more Labour MPs beyond the 4 that I mentioned, who may feel that delivering Brexit is what they've committed to do, their constituents want it, so they might at that point abandon the Labour Party position and join those 4 Labour MPs in supporting the Chequers deal or something similar. The Lib Dem position is we believe that the best deal we can have is the one that we've already got in the European Union. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, we should work to reform it. We should make it more relevant. We should deal with some of the problems that about bureaucracy and so on. But we believe that being in the EU is the best deal on offer. So whatever the government come forward with in terms of a deal, we're not going to back it. And then we have the Conservative members of Parliament. Now, there are a number of Conservative MPs who have voted against the government. The 2 most prominent, Anna Soubry and Ken Clarke. Now, Ken Clarke on referenda, he hates them. He thought that there should never be one in the first place, so whether he would vote for the idea of people's vote, I think not. If he's consistent with hating referenda, then he shouldn't be voting for this. So we probably can't count on his support. There are a number of others like Justin Greening, who's talked about having a 3-vote option for a people's vote, so going for the deal, whatever it is, going for no deal or going for staying in the EU. I think that having 3 options on the ballot paper is an absolute nightmare, because you could end up with 34% of people voting for one option, 33% for the other 2, and then we're into months and months, years and years of legal battles, arguments about who cheated, who didn't, and so on. So the idea of the 3, I think, is really, I wouldn't want to go there. I don't really want to see no deal on the ballot paper anyway, because that's so Justin Greening is out there, Philip Lee, Guterbeg, and possibly others. There are other Conservative members of Parliament who are already on record saying that if the Prime Minister comes forward with no deal, then they're going to block it. So you get a picture of quite how complicated this is in terms of numbers. So really, if we do have a vote, a meaningful vote, if we do have a vote on whether there should be a people's vote, if we, each vote could be won or lost by 2, 3, 4, 5 votes. Could depend on, is someone ill on the day? Did someone get caught in a traffic jam? Did the train get stopped on the approaches to London? Did the government break the pairing arrangements again? Any number of permutations which could lead to the vote going one way or the other. So probably I should finish there. I mean, all I've done is really, I've probably just created the picture which is about confusion, but that, I'm afraid, is exactly where we are. It is possible that, as happened, we were expecting on the Trade and Customs Bill, we were really reasonably confident that the government was going to lose. And then that really there would have been a crisis, because if Parliament had voted for one of the amendments that talked about us, the country, being in a customs union, which would have been a direct clash with what the Prime Minister has said, that we're not going to be in the customs union, and we're not going to be in a customs union, we had expected that vote to be carried by the opposition parties, but it didn't happen. So it may be that all of the people who've expressed strong views about this might peel off, and we might find that the Chequers deal or something similar gets voted through. I suppose the final thing I would say, at our party conference earlier today, I got quite a loud round of applause when I said some sort of friendly words to Mr. Barnier. And that is, Mr. Barnier, do not facilitate a soft fudge deal. Can't read it without my glasses.
What about the law, not the SNP?
Okay, all right. So Mr. Barnier, do not facilitate a soft fudge. Now, Mr. Barnier has his own personal reasons why he has ambitions in Europe, which really require him to sort this out and move on, so he can do other things. But we don't want him to sort it out and move on to other things by ending up with the most almighty fudge that no one understands, and then is left with this government or a future government to try to sort out what on earth this fudge means. Now, the note says, what about the SNP, for starters, and the Lords? Well, the SNP are, I'm afraid, a little bit two-faced on this. On the one hand, Scotland voted very strongly to remain, and that percentage has increased as they're seeing the catastrophe that is sort of unveiling in front of us. And so the SNP in Parliament make lots of speeches saying Brexit, oh, it's a disaster, and so on. But when it comes to will they go public about supporting a people's vote, they won't. They are remarkably quiet. You will not get any of them standing up and making a very clear statement about we support the people's vote. And why is that the case? Well, it's fairly obvious. It is because for the SNP, the chances of them securing independence, they believe, are maximised by the Westminster government forcing on Scotland leaving the European Union. And then they think, well, that would be brilliant because that will make Scotland really angry, and then the next time we get a chance to vote for leaving the United Kingdom, that's when we will get the vote in our favour. So we are putting pressure on them. We got a lot of coverage in the last couple of days from our party conference on it, because we're trying to call them out, saying, well, Scotland voted very heavily to remain. How come you've not been willing to support a people's vote, which is the only way that we can see of getting out of this mess that is Brexit? So finally, on the Lords, well, the Lords, yes, the Lords do have powers to slow things down and so on, but in reality, when it comes to the meaningful vote, when it comes to securing an amendment or putting through an amendment that will enable a final say on the deal to take place, or it force the government to go back and negotiate, that's very much something that's in the hands of the Commons. It's not something that the Lords can influence, which is a pity, because of course The Lords were blocked from debating one of the two bills that we passed back to them, the Trade and Customs Bill, because I think, frankly, because the government said that one of the bills, the Customs Bill, was a money bill, which means the Lords can't amend it. Very, very arguable as to whether it was, but and the government were anticipating rightly that had the Lords been able to table amendments to it, they would have tabled a raft of amendments to try to amend the bill very heavily. So, but I mean, the battle about this is the Commons. It's not in the Lords, and the battle, I would finish by saying, it should be in the constituency surgeries of every single member of Parliament who is not already signed up to the idea of having a people's vote. So, you know, if you, I don't know from how far afield people are coming, but you know, whether your MP was a weak Remainer, probably don't need to bother with a strong Remainer. If they're a weak Leaver or a strong Leaver, you should be going to there, demanding to see them at their surgery, and picketing them if they won't see you. And you should be going through their front door, you should be sitting down with them and saying to them, here are some reasons why Brexit is going to be bad for me personally, or my son, or my daughter, or my grandfather, or my employer, or me as an employer, and putting them on the spot. I had a very good example at a business event I was at earlier today, where someone said, we had a contract that was, we were delivering in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and they have said to us, sorry, we're not going to be renewing that with you because there's so much uncertainty about what's going to be happening in the future. We're going to source that service from somewhere else. Most of you will be able to think of examples like that either affected you directly or people close to you. You should be demanding to talk to your Member of Parliament and putting them on the spot as to what are you going to do about this. This is not about Project Fear, this is the experience of individuals, businesses around the country happening now, and they need to hear that. And there have been examples recently in the past where some of you may have been involved in a campaign which happened during the coalition period around what a perceived threat. Personally, I didn't think it was a genuine threat, but a perceived threat that the government of the day were going to privatise all the forests. And it was a very large national campaign which managed to change the government's position because you know, there were so many people lobbying on that issue that eventually the government said, well, we don't actually think that there is a plan to privatise the forest, but we will make it absolutely clear, we'll change the legislation to make it absolutely clear that that is not what is intended. So there are occasions where the government will respond, and on something as critical as this, which is going to have an impact on us for a generation or more, they really should respond. Thank you, Richard.